She knows how to swing it.
Good morning, everyone. I am a Regent Chair, Janie Mayron, Chair of the Governance and Policy Committee. I am calling the October 11, 2000 meeting of this committee at this time. And I'm hopeful all my colleagues are seated here. I think we're getting everybody here.
Pay attention.
All right, we are here to address three different topics this morning. One is the work plan of this committee. The second topic is the policies bearing on board conduct, and the third is the naming policy. Just to share with my fellow colleagues here, we have an hour and 15 minutes to get through these three topics. I want to make sure that we spend the bulk of our time on the second topic, which is the policies bearing on board conduct, so that we can get your respective input on outstanding issues that bear on this topic. So my intention is to spend approximately 5 minutes, and hopefully not even 5 minutes, on the work plan of this committee, 85 minutes on the policies bearing on board conduct, and leaving 15 minutes for President Gable to discuss her work on the naming policy. So with that, our first item on the agenda is the 2019-2020 committee work plan. At this time, I invite Executive Director Steves to make a few framing comments before any committee discussion on this matter.
Thank you, Madam Chair and members of the committee. The work plan is fairly straightforward. The topics that are on your agenda today are carried through the work plan. So you'll see the code of conduct topic carried through in several meetings, as well as the namings topic carried through. Further out in your work plan, you'll see a couple of policies that are bracketed. That's because they are under comprehensive review, and we anticipate that they may be ready to bring forward in the winter timeframe. And if so, they will be brought forward for consideration by the committee. And if not, we'll reevaluate the timing of those. And then the committee work plan wraps up the year with its policy report and the work plan for the coming year after that, as well as a discussion around a framework for the board to do a self-assessment, which is a best practice and one that we've been talking with committee leadership about undertaking. So that kind of rounds out the work plan.
Thank you, Executive Director Steves. Any discussion or comments by any of the regents on the work plan? All right, hearing none, we will then move to the second topic on our agenda, which is regarding the open policy issues related to board conduct. At this time, I would ask that Executive Director Steves begin, but before you do, let me just give a context of what we're going to be doing here with respect to this. Director Steves is going to give us an overview of the issue. You all had sent to you, I believe it was last week, the framing memo that was prepared by Executive Steves, which I think does an excellent job of outlining the outstanding issues, questions related to those issues for the committee to consider, with the hope that we can get your input, and hopefully it will lead to consensus about creating policies around those particular topics. My intention when we actually get to this, you'll see there are 5 outstanding issues that have been identified where we want to make sure we're getting input and having dialogue about them. My intention is we're going to address the 4th and 5th issues first. If for no other reason, then I think our collective sense is that we probably can reach consensus on those issues more quickly, and I'm hoping if we can create some success early on in our discussions, that will guide us well in the discussion on the remaining 3 topics, which are items 1, 2, and 3 that are identified in the framing memo by Executive Steves. So with that, Executive Director Steves, if you want to briefly take us through where we are on this matter.
Yes, Madam Chair, we'll move briskly through this slide deck. I know that you've all had an opportunity to review these materials ahead of time, so we'll just move right through them and then get to the discussion. So As you know, we've been engaging in this comprehensive review of the Code of Ethics. There have been significant conversations and consensus reached on a number of areas, and we'll just touch on those. I'll just move to the areas of consensus. That is that we are taking elements of 3 policies and consolidating them into a single policy that will provide greater clarity and ease of use in terms of just understanding your responsibilities as a board member. We plan to reorganize those, reduce redundancy, streamline it, but also enhance clarity in many ways. And then finally, there's a lot of consensus around better articulating fiduciary responsibilities. I think we all agreed that those responsibilities are reflected in existing policy, but not in an explicit way or in a way that is very clear to an average reader. So those are some areas of consensus. And then moving on to open areas for discussion, really there are 5. Communicating with the media, remedies for breaches of the Code of Conduct, information requests, running for partisan elective office, and conflicts of interest related to a family member. And so I'll just march through those pretty quickly and talk a little bit about the open questions before the board, as well as, in some cases, some language that might get us down the road toward a consensus position on it. In many ways, the reason that we're offering even some suggested language or offering up just some language for reaction is so that you have something to react to. It's much more difficult to react to a blank piece of paper than it is to react to something that you see in writing and say, yeah, that's kind of hitting the mark, or no, that's not hitting the mark at all. And that's the kind of feedback we need. We need to be able to understand where the group is so that we can bring back a draft policy that it is in alignment with what the standards are that you want to hold yourselves to. All right, so communicating with the media. Current policy, as you know, establishes the president as the primary spokesperson and the chair as the person authorized to speak for the board. It also talks about the responsibility each regent has to speak forthrightly at board meetings and support board decisions when determined. Really, the questions before the committee are, should policy address this topic at all? And how do fiduciary responsibilities, such as duty to loyalty, intersect with your First Amendment rights, which allow you to speak and offer your views on things? And does timing matter? Does it matter that you offer views ahead of board consideration of a topic, at board meetings, following board consideration of a topic, following board vote? Does the timing of when you offer those comments matter? And we actually did a fair amount of work, and you saw this in both in the memo as well as in the document materials, at looking at peer institutions on this topic and where do they stand. And the fact is that everybody's all over the map. There isn't a best practice on this. Illinois, Purdue, Michigan have policies that are very similar to our policy on this. Whereas Nebraska and Rutgers say, yes, our chair speaks for the board, but they don't have formal written policies. It's more of an informal understanding that they've developed over time. Then you have Iowa, Indiana, Michigan State, and Ohio State that are silent on this topic. So when we have this first question, should policy even address this? I mean, you could legitimately say that you don't want to address it in policy and either use an informal procedure or go in a different direction altogether. So it really has a wide range of responses just in the Big Ten. So we drafted something that is both informed by the current policy as well as the conversations that I know we've kind of absorbed individually over time from members of the board. And that would be that establishing the president as the primary spokesperson, talking about the board as the board chair as the person who speaks for the board when necessary. And then certainly affirming regents' right to share their personal views, but balancing that, or at least suggesting that there needs to be a balance with that against their fiduciary responsibilities, and ensuring that they're aware of the tone and substance of their words and how that can reflect on and have consequences for the university. Certainly then again echoes this notion of speaking forthrightly at board meetings and supporting board decisions when determined. So again, offered up as potential language so that when we talk about this, there's something for you to react to. All right, we'll move on. Breaches of the Code of Ethics. Currently, your policy is silent on this topic, and it relies on Robert's Rules of Order. In the memo that was shared, we actually copied the relevant section of Robert's Rules of Order and shared that with you. It's extensive, and I would venture maybe a bit tedious in how it approaches that topic, but certainly is an option. The options really before you include remaining silent and continuing to rely on Robert's rules as the mechanism through which those kinds of breaches would be addressed. Or the board could consider establishing some sort of trigger or process without trying to define or articulate what those specific remedies might be. That language might look like what's included here. And you'll see that it pegs to having 5 regents sign a written complaint of some sort. And that is drawn directly from your bylaws. And your bylaws indicate that when 5 regents in writing request a special meeting of the board, the chair is compelled to call such a meeting. And so it's just echoing that 5 regents from your bylaws. In this case, it would be that there would be some sort of complaint before the board, and then the board would convene and hear that matter, and then define at that point in time what sort of remedies it wished to impose. All right, moving on. Information requests. Currently, policy is silent on this topic, except for some language around seeking to be fully informed about the university and its role in higher education. There are 2 examples of universities that have attempted to address this topic, the University of Nebraska and University of Texas. At least, we haven't looked at every university in the country, but these are of peer institutions. We've been able to find these 2. Nebraska's is fairly informal. It relies on an executive committee to kind of intervene when a request would be onerous in some way. And then the University of Texas process is much more extensive. So the question before the board on this topic is, should a process be established in policy that sets expectations around this? It really is one that not very many boards have attempted to do, as you can see. In fact, we couldn't find, aside from Nebraska, we couldn't find any other Big Ten peers who have attempted to write something into policy on this topic. The other thing I would just note is, given Minnesota's Data Practices Act and the information that is available through that mechanism, I mean, it's just a question of whether and how you might construct language that would draw lines around an individual regent's ability to request information. So, partisan political activity. Currently, policy requires that a regent resign upon officially announcing candidacy for any partisan elective office. So the question on this topic is, should policy be amended to perhaps allow regents to run for elective office with partisan endorsement while providing guidance on how their candidacy might impact the university? If the board were to desire some language in that direction, one option might be to use disclosure and existing conflict language to manage that period of candidacy. For instance, it could indicate that before becoming a candidate for partisan office, a regent should inform the board and consult with the general counsel to evaluate any conflicts of interest that might arise from being a candidate for. But then it could continue on to say, if elected to a partisan office or an office from which you had partisan endorsement, a regent shall resign from the board. So it might actually marry up or just provide a little greater definition around the timing of that. And then finally, conflict of interest related to a family member. Current policy establishes that a conflict arises when a family member of a regent has a financial interest in matters before the board. It doesn't provide any guidance around when a family member is an employee of the university. And so it would be possible, if desired by the board, to include new language in that same area of policy where, in addition to those financial interests before the board, it could indicate that an employment relationship by a family member at the university could constitute a conflict that would require some sort of mitigation or disclosure to remedy. So with that, moving quickly, those are the slide decks. That's the slide deck, and happy to engage in conversation.
All right, thank you very much, Executive Director Steves. My hope is that through this conversation with each other that we will reach sufficient consensus on each of these 5 outstanding issues such that then we can proceed forward to actually draft language for your review at the December meeting. That's the goal. But right now we're in that stage where we want to see if we can even build consensus on each of these topics. And of course, with each topic comes the initial question, should there be a policy on this? And then the question is, if there should be some sort of policy, we should address it. What is the group's hopefully collective thinking on what the contents of that policy should be? So what I'd like to do, as I indicated, is I'd like to start with topic number 4, which is the issue of if an individual is running for a partisan office, has indicated that they intend to run for partisan office, whether at that time the policy, we should be amending the policy to allow regents to, whether we should amend the policy to address that simply saying I'm running for office is sufficient to raise perhaps potential conflict of interest or other issues, and we should have a policy on it. So before you have what the current policy is. You have really the way the board's office has framed the question. Obviously, you can frame it any way you want to, but looking for input on whether there should be language in our policy governing this or not. And before you answer that, let me just say I don't want to get bogged down does this appear in a code of conduct or individual responsibilities, or where will it appear? The assumption is we're going to come up with a document that is going to govern our conduct, and what we end up calling it, we can address that at the December meeting. I really want to have us focus on the substance of each of these issues. So with that, let's see, Regent Beeson has indicated that you have some comments. Regent Beeson?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair, for just backing up for a minute and undertaking a look at all of this and then organizing it in a way that we can provide. I see it as just sort of some informal, high-level feedback, section by section. As relates to this one, I think this one needs work. I would say that the current policy is not appropriate, that a regent would resign upon announcing the candidacy. We had a regent for many years who was on a school board and still is, Regent Cohen. And I think, although that wasn't partisan, I don't know that a partisan office necessarily should disqualify somebody, other than if they're elected to the state legislature. That would be the one carve-out I would insist on, that we really cannot have sitting legislators on this board. But beyond that, I don't have as much difficulty if they're with a city council or a county, and the fact that they're partisan, I don't think should trigger removal. That's just my initial reaction. And
So let me just clarify in terms of what you said. To the extent that the current policy requires a person to resign upon officially announcing candidacy for any partisan elective office, you think that should be changed? That's
Yes.
number one.
Yes.
And number two, do you think that if a person does announce candidacy for a partisan office, that it should be addressed in some other fashion, for example, through the conflict of interest procedure, or not addressed at all, or what?
Madam Chair, I would say it would be addressed to the conflict of interest. Yes, that would be where I would put that.
And the last thing I heard you say is that if a person was elected to a partisan office, they shall resign, but that partisan office be limited to the legislature.
Yes, that would be.
Okay, thank you. Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Mayeron. I'm largely in agreement with Regent Beeson. It doesn't seem to me that apart from workload and ability to get to do the duties of a regent, we have any significant reason to care if someone wants to be on a city council or be a mayor or be a county commissioner even. Given the funding role that the legislature plays in our everyday life here, though, I think I agree that a state legislative office creates some significant potential concerns, and probably statewide office would be similar too. So if you're elected to a statewide leadership role, that attorney general or whatever, or governor, I mean, those would obviously bring up concerns about being able to do both, given the intensity of those sort of jobs. But otherwise, I'm fully in agreement with where Regent Beeson landed. And I want to add, thank you for compiling a extraordinarily difficult and often complex set of materials into one concise document here. It doesn't answer the questions, but at least it frames them up so that we can get our arms around this set of challenges.
Thank you, Executive Director. That's really a thank you to you, Executive Director Steves. All right, Regent Rocha?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm in agreement almost entirely, I think, and trying to really kind of define. I would maybe come back a step from even enumerating legislator. Only to the extent, I mean, I'm in complete agreement. I don't think it would be appropriate for someone to serve as a legislator and as a member of this body. The challenge is, it's the expressio unius sort of thing, that there are others that also would not be appropriate. And so to say only legislator would then imply that other things might be okay. And so I think it would come down to obviously this is not, I don't want to say shadow boxing, but we're certainly speculating that this might come up at some point in the future. We haven't, I don't think, faced this. First 2 points, I'm in complete agreement. I think that the conversation, the way that this was drafted up to the point of requiring resignation, because partisan office is too broad, I think. We have a history of people like Regent Bonesock and Regent Mary Page and others who have held county commissioner positions while also serving on this board. School boards, in some places there are partisan endorsements, some places there are not, and I think so it really becomes a function of looking at both the campaign for a position and then the potential conflict once that person holds that second office, where that I think that's the proper time to really, I think, dig into it. As to whether that conflict makes it impossible. My hunch is that I've got a high level of confidence that if somebody were to hold another office, like as a legislator, you would recognize it wouldn't be practical or likely that you would continue to serve in both. Even then, I think that you run into sort of constitutional questions that we might not be in a position to enforce. At that point, if somebody were to try to do that, I think that there would be almost kind of a third-party conversation about whether the person would be allowed to serve in both. So, but for that last sentence, as my colleagues have pointed out, I support the proposed language.
Any other comments or input by other regents here on this topic of partisan political activity? Regent Hsu?
Thank you, Chair Maron. I'm not in disagreement. I'm questioning whether or not we need a policy for this, but I would like to understand more of the history behind it. How did this ever get into the policy in the first place? Has it ever been actually used in here? And I know that we have one person sitting around the horseshoe right now who actually resigned once, was forced to resign, as I understand it, because of, maybe not because of this, obviously, but I just kind of I want to understand from Regent Swigum how that went around, how it happened, and whether or not you were forced into it, or if you could just give us some background.
Let me use my chair's prerogative here. I think you're asking an important question, but I want to caution we have a number of topics to get through. My hope is that on the topics 4 and 5, we would spend about 10 minutes on these topics, and so that we could spend the balance of the time on the topics that I think are going to be more, engender more discussion. So I understand your desire to learn the history behind this. I don't want to try to cut it off by saying that ship has sailed. It is what it is. The question is, what do we do on a going forward basis? But I want to caution you on getting into that level of detail at this time, and perhaps a conversation that you had with Regent Swigum privately might give you some history, or with Executive Director Steeves on what the history is behind this particular provision. Just, that's a suggestion on my part. I see, I don't know if you wanted to respond before I go back between Regent Hsu and Regent Swigum. Regent Kenyatta, you had your hand up, and I don't know if it bears on my comments or you wanted to weigh in on something different. Okay, then we'll just get you down here. Regent Hsu, would you be comfortable addressing the history behind that in a different time, either privately with Regent Swigum or with Executive Director Steeves?
Well, I mean,
or does it bear on your input right now?
Well, my input right now is I don't think we need to have, I mean, if I look at the language here, Chair Miron.
Are you looking at the proposed language?
I'm looking at the proposed language. I'm kind of questioning whether or not we even need that language in here, in this format, because it still says, if elected to a partisan office, a regent shall resign from the board. I don't know that we can force people off the board, and that's why it's important for me to understand why Steve resigned the first time and why he's back now. And you know, maybe circumstances are different, but I think it's important. Otherwise, I would just say I don't need the language, and we can move on.
Regent Swigum, did you want to respond?
First of all, just a couple of quick comments. In response to our current policy, I want you to know that I completely support Regent Kenya as run for the state Senate.
That was a secret.
And secondly, Regent Davenport and I switched sides, but looking at Simonson and Sue, the view doesn't get any better, does it?
All right, Regent Swigum.
I'm sorry.
Do you have any
just a
response
little levity to
I appreciate that. I'm trying
to a past history that was not such levity. And I would just assume not speak publicly about it. I'd like to talk to Regent Sue a little privately, give a little background. And I kind of believe in life, you need to graciously move on. And so if possible, I'd like to abstain from making any comments to history, and you don't need to open this over.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Regent Kenyatta?
Thank you. Thank you, Chair Miron. So I tend to agree with Regent Beeson and Regent McMillan, and especially when you look at those more local levels of government, there really isn't an inherent conflict. But as I think of kind of where Regent Hsu was going, why the policy exists, and what it says in our documents here, this language was likely intended to shield the university and the board from becoming entangled in partisan issues. Is that still not a concern? I ask that rhetorically, just knowing the nature of political campaigns and the frequency of the person being in the media and the statements. They're associated with the university, and they're going to be associated with the university even in their campaign, even though that's a separate position. So I just like us to think if that's still not a concern. I don't know if that makes sense.
Thank you. Thank you, Regent Kenyatta. One comment that I wanted to share as I was looking at the proposed language for us to react to was whether it should be, we talked about this issue of partisan elected office and what does that mean. And it was evident if it meant statewide, like a legislator or the governor or something like that. But it was also raised with me, for example, in Minneapolis, there are partisan designations, both for city council and for the mayor. And obviously, we do a lot of work with Minneapolis. We're in Minneapolis, in St. Paul as well. And so the question that I'm raising for you all is whether, if we're going to look at some language here, do we want to confine it to statewide partisan elective activity, or do we need to at least create the opportunity to examine if there's something that's close to home where the university actually sits and there is partisan activity going on, whether those running for office, a person should be at least disclosing it to address any potential conflict issues as well. So my question is, should it be restricted to statewide activity, or perhaps that may be the reason why it was left elected to partisan office and didn't restrict it to statewide offices? Any comments?
Yield to Regent Rocha.
All right, Regent Rocha?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This is a good conversation, and I appreciate your desire to move to the next topics. What Regent Shu's point, I think, is salient in that the language as it is now constructed, with the exception of the last line, which I think is not enforceable by this board, is actually, that is actually in our conflict of interest policy. The obligation to seek advice and counsel if a person is entering into a business transaction or some other relationship that could potentially create a conflict. We have that obligation as board members already. And so to some extent, this is kind of emphasizing in this scenario, and perhaps the best argument for doing so is the fact that we have a policy already. And so then, which I think is, I don't support the current language. So this is a softening of that. If you take the final sentence of this language out, I don't think the language before that does harm. I think that, so then the question is it worth putting in? And if it is put in, is there harm? I don't think there necessarily is. The obligation to inform the board in advance, so what happens if we read, open up the paper and Beeson for governor has been announced and the campaign committee has been formed, but he didn't tell us until the next day that he's looking to run for governor. Would that be a violation of a legitimate policy? I don't necessarily think so, but I think that our obligation to be sensitive to the fact that partisan politics does have an impact on the public's perception. I'm interested in what our policy is. We have faculty and other staff who run for partisan office within the university. And so do we have a policy with respect to that? I'm not sure that we do. I'd be interested because it is that same sort of agency question. To me, the easiest response is that we wouldn't speak to it, that we would require our other ethics provisions to address it, to the extent that we want to put language, again, subject to removing the final sentence. I could be supportive of that as well.
Madam Chair.
I think Regent Beeson is next, and then I'll hear from Regent Kenyatta, and then we're going to move on to the next topic.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I think maybe everybody agrees the word partisan is sort of an artifact. Whether somebody runs for office, a nonpartisan or a partisan, it really shouldn't be treated any differently as relates to their work on this board. However, I go back to the scale of the job. If it is a statewide office or a legislator, that becomes a very, very different than anything else that we could have if those people were local candidates. So that's where I draw the line, is statewide office if you're elected, not if you're running. I mean, people can run all the time, but it doesn't impact this board until you are elected.
To resign. You're talking about to resign. All right, and then Regent Kenyatta.
Say point of information. I just want to make sure I understand. When you say statewide, a legislator is not a statewide office, but it's a state office.
Well, Regent Rocha, Madam Chair, I was thinking that as a statewide because they do take the oath.
It's like a state office or a statewide position, which would be a federal position.
Well, I meant state legislator as well. I'm using that as a statewide because they take the oath of the state constitution, but.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Regent Kenyatta.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Very briefly, just another point to maybe think about. Our code of ethics under public trust talks about regents shall not use the authority, title, or prestige of the office to gain a list of benefits, and one of them is political benefit. And you open the door for someone campaigning to really lean and use their regent title and experience to prop it up, and perhaps even run for the board as an intention of using that as a stepping stone. Maybe I'm exaggerating a bit there, but it is a possibility. So just thinking about that part of our code of ethics that says that the office should not be used to gain political benefit.
Thank you. All right. Obviously, each one of these topics can engender, as we talk and dialogue with each other, additional thoughts. If there are other thoughts that you wish to share, you could certainly do that with Executive Director Steves to make sure that we're getting anybody's input. But at this time, we're going to move on to the second topic, which is whether the conflict of interest policy relating to a Regents family member should include language if that individual is an employee of the university. And again, the initial question is, should we be addressing this issue? And if so, what is your input on whether it should or shouldn't include a university employee? Any thoughts for discussion by any of the regents on this particular topic? I'm seeing Regent McMillan.
Thank you, Chair Maron. I found the proposed solution to be a pretty simple way to handle it. So I like it.
You like the proposed language that that
It
executive
seems to
director
get at
says?
the issue at hand, and we've got a very robust conflict of interest process already in place that can be brought to bear on an issue. And if your spouse works for the university, it seems like it could raise the same issues if I work for the university. So it looked like a pretty straightforward way to handle it. That's my reaction.
All right. Any other regent wish to weigh in on this particular issue? All right. Then we will, I want to move on because I want to get on to the more important issues. Am I taking the collective silence other than Regent McMillan's comment that he likes the language of that the Executive Director Steves came up with here to address a family member who is an employee, that you like it and we should go forward? In other words, we have consensus on this particular one or not? I just want to make sure I'm reading your silence accurately. Yes, Regent Beeson.
Thank you, Mr. So what I'm to read in the proposed language is that if a member of the family works for the university, that there's automatically a conflict of interest and a need to develop a mitigation plan? Because this feels a little strong in terms of automatically assuming that a family member has got a conflict without having a situation that is specific in creating the conflict.
Can we back up one slide so we can make sure that we understand what the current language is? Conflict of interest arises when a family member of a regent has a financial interest in matters before the board. And so then the question is whether employment is consistent with that particular policy.
So Madam Chair, so the current policy deals with a situation in which a family member has business that's brought to the board. And then the proposed language has to do with whether they're employed at the board or at the university. And I don't know if this feels a little bit heavy. I don't know what we're trying to solve.
Executive Director Steves, do you have any input on
I'd like
this?
to talk this through, Madam Chair.
Yeah.
Okay.
Madam Chair, so in one sense, the reading of current policy could suggest that it already exists in the sense that all compensation, pools that are created at the university come to this board for consideration, and anybody that was an employee would obviously stand to have a financial interest in that. That would be one reading of it. That's not been the reading of current policy, though. The current policy has been read to include things like a family member who owns a business and that business is going to sell goods and services to the university. And so this has been kind of a gray area, a question, and it's come up in the past, and that's why by adding that additional language, what it would do is indicate that this means that an employment relationship with the university, any family member who is an employee of the university, it does actually trigger this. The creation of a conflict or declaring something a conflict of interest is not a bad thing. It simply means that disclosure and some sort of mitigation is required, and sometimes disclosure is all that's required, and that's sufficient. It just means that there needs to be some kind of an affirmative acknowledgement and plan to deal with it.
Regent Beeson, Clerk. Yep.
Thank you. Well, that goes to sort of the disclosure statement that we all sign each year, and I could see where that would be. It should be part of a disclosure, but it's implied that there is a conflict by calling it a conflict of interest instead of a disclosure item. I'm glad we talked about the disclosure because that's sort of underlies the conflict of interest policy. And we have language in here in the disclosure.
Next person is Regent Shu.
Yes, thank you. Along with Regent Beeson's questions and concepts, where is this actual current policy now? The one that's on the page on the screen now. Where is that actually in the policies?
Go ahead.
Madam Chair,
yes.
that language is from your current Code of Ethics policy.
Okay. Well, I'm looking at it now. I don't find the exact language in there where I thought it should be. But I mean, again, I think it's covered. But you're saying that it's a gray area. I think is what you're saying, and I think it's pretty clear in the existing language. But if we need to fix the language, then I think we should fix the language. But I don't understand where this language comes from.
Any response by you, Executive Director Steves? Otherwise, I'll go on to Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Yes, so there's a couple things I think that aren't in front of us right now. The one that relates to university employment, regents themselves, that's not in front of us. Nor is the definition of family member, which right now we're all think we kind of get what it means. But those, laying those out, I think would be helpful to understand. I'm in agreement with Regent McMillan on this. The challenge is not simply that there would potentially be a conflict in voting on the compensation pool or something of that nature. I think one of the questions becomes if a member of our board has a close family member. Now, this, of course, in the employment, it carves out student employment. If the student member is still a student and has student employment, that's carved out. I think that would also be appropriate for family members. If you're the parent of a student employee or something, that I think is relevant as well. It's not just a matter of the compensation. It calls into question whether or not the family member of a member of this board is somehow shielded from the normal review, the normal relationship between their supervisor and the employee. Will there be some sense that that person is untouchable in the event that they're not performing well or something of that nature? And so it does raise that question where if you have a family member who is an employee at the university and you seek a position on this board, does that create some level of a question for other members of the community as to whether that individual now has an advantage over other employees of the university? The stronger position would be that falls under the same, it's no different than if one of us were also employed. Would we be subject to the same treatment as other employees? And so from that standpoint, to the extent that we're protecting the board and that perception of avoiding those kinds of conflicts, I think the stronger language as stated by Regent McMillan is sound, and I would support that.
All right, Regent Spiegelman. Any further comments on this issue?
I don't think I can add any clarification to what Regent Rose just said. I do think with Regent Beeson, the language tended to be a little heavy and too all-inclusive. I think in life, disclosure takes care of many things. Being able to, in certain circumstances, abstain from voting takes care of many things. And I don't think we want to, how far down the line do you go? Working for the university, working for a contractor of the university. I mean, we've had members of the body and former presidents whose direct family members have been part of a business and contracts with the university. It is a pretty slippery slope when you start going down and you start restricting people's ability to live and make a living and provide for their family. I get concerned if it gets too heavy, Mr. Beeson.
All right, let me see if I can summarize where we are on this. And that is, I'm hearing that members who have spoken are interested in making sure that the disclosure happens, that if a family member is employed by the university, that is disclosed. Whether that actually gets labeled up front as a conflict of interest or after examination under our conflict of interest policy, it gets labeled at that time either is or isn't a conflict of interest, which requires some mitigation. I'm hearing that there may be disagreement on that particular issue, but at a minimum, I'm hearing that requiring Regents to disclose any family member who is employed by the university so that at least it's on our radar screen to address a potential conflict is something that the Regents do want to at least go at least that far. And then we'll have to see whether we actually want to call it a conflict of interest as we currently label it if you have a financial interest. I do think it's important to clarify this so that people know what they need to disclose and what potentially could or couldn't be a conflict of interest where a person has a financial interest. Examples have been given by different regions. So with that comment in mind, Regent Simonson, and we'll close with Regent Shu, and then we'll move on to the next topic.
Thank you, Chair Myron, and I totally agree with that disclosure idea. And going back to what Regent Kenyana said about looking at the code of ethics and our professional ethical integrity responsibilities as being on the board. And so when I look at this here and I say, is it too heavy, financial interest? Well, if I have a child here going to school, and we're looking at tuition.
That's exempted.
That's true.
Isn't that a financial?
It's exempted.
So I'm thinking it's pretty vague. I don't know if it's heavy. It's pretty vague. And so I question a lot of these, these policies versus just looking at our code of ethics. When I was elected to the board last year, I spent a lot of time with general counsel saying, here's the things I'm involved in. And I was on a board at the veterinary college, and so I resigned from it. He suggested that as an ethical thing. And so I think those kinds of things are very important to our positions.
Good. Thank you. Thank you, Regent Simonson. And we'll close with a final question or comments by Regent Shu.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Miron. I just want to make a quick reference to the definition of family member in our code of ethics. And, it says simply family member shall mean a spouse, parent, sibling, child, domestic partner, or any person residing in the Regent's household. And I think that's a little bit, it brings up the question of, well, what about, grandchildren? And there's all sorts of other people. And now, unless you say that it's only people residing in your household, then that's clear. But if you're talking about other people who may be quote unquote family members that don't reside with you, then I think it needs some clarification.
All right. Again, if there are any other input that other regions wish to provide or those who have, then I would suggest you direct them to Executive Director Steves so that we make sure we have everyone's collective wisdom on these issues. All right, let's move then to topic number 1, which is communicating with the media. And we have that up on the screen here. Right now, there is no policy that addresses this issue, and so you can see the questions that were posed by Executive Director Steves about should there be a policy, if so, what the contours of that policy should be. And I'll open it for discussion at this time. Any comments or input by Regents on this issue? Regent Simonson?
Thank you, Chair. I don't think there should be a policy. We were all elected by the legislature. We have the responsibilities, as I said before, and I don't think I think we all have a responsibility to speak and support the university. So I don't think it should just be in one person. We're a team. We're a team.
Okay. Other input or comments by other regents here? Regent Sviggum.
Just a comment and a background, and I don't know if we need a policy or not, or even should have one, Regent Simonson, because we all have the right to be elected by ourselves and by the legislature and to speak for our own values and our own feelings. But I would suggest this, that if there be a disclaimer by the regent when asked by Dylan, we need to respond. We need to speak for ourselves, but the disclaimer should be that we speak only for ourselves as a regent. I think only the chair of the board can speak for the board as a whole. And there's a big difference between speaking for the board or speaking as a regent on an issue. I think that if we make that disclaimer when Dylan asked me and I said, I'm only speaking for myself, I'm only one of 12 on the board, I have the perfect freedom and right to do whatever I want to and say whatever I want to, but only former Chair Beeson or now Chair Powell can speak for the board as a whole. It would be wrong for me to speak for the board as a whole, I think. And the other thing, and this gets into just our actions here at the board as a group. You know, we're all going to have differences. They were exhibited yesterday. We're going to have lots of differences. But when a decision is made, by this board, right or wrong, and usually I'm in the minority of that decision, I have to support the board's action. And I think it's really important that we have that. This gets into a different issue, but that team aspect that we support the board's action when the board's made a decision, even though I personally may have disagreed with it.
All right, thank you. Regent Beeson.
Thank you. I agree with Regent Sviggum. I think the language definitely should be in the policy. It is now whether a violation of it is subject, whether that's a breach or subject to remedies is a different matter. But as a matter of principle, I think that should be stated, and it's a set of expectations for all high-functioning organizations. The president is a spokesperson, and then beyond that, the chair of the board is or the delegate. I mean, I think that has to be that has worked over the decades. That's best practice. The time to speak individually is at the board meetings. And I understand people's First Amendment rights, and that's why I think it's a different matter about what happens when people violate this. But I think as a matter of principle, we need to have this in writing. I mean, it's just the right thing to do. That's how good organizations operate. And if we want to be a good organization, we need to be following this regularly.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. Regent Rocha, you had a comment.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I have no objection to language in the policy that would say, refer to the president as the spokesperson for the university. I have no objection to language that refers to the chair of the board as speaking for the board. That comes with a caveat. I think it's important that the board chair only speak for the board when the board actually has taken a position. If the board has not yet considered a matter or has, if the board is yet to take a position, I think that needs to be clear, so that it doesn't give, going to Regent Beeson's point about having the conversation at the board, if you haven't had that opportunity to weigh in, I think that creates some confusion. And I think it's a powerful asset to the chair, and I think that it needs to, that needs to be clear. But with respect to, we talk about loyalty versus First Amendment timing, support for board decisions once made. The subjective continuum, I think, becomes unwieldy. It's impossible, I think, to say, well, what does that mean? If this board were to take a position that we're no longer going to admit Catholic students to the university, and 7 of my colleagues vote for that, I'm not going to feel compelled to remain quiet about that. I would find that to be inappropriate, and I would say so publicly. We are in a public office. I am very wary about trying to limit one's right to have an opinion and to be known as to the opinion that individual holds. I find the language support the board board decisions when determined. I understand the concept that we need to make decisions on sort of the routine items, get behind them, and move forward. But I don't think that we can dictate what's in the heart of a member of this board. Using the example that I just used, the mere fact that 7 people voted for it, I don't suddenly change my personal perspective. If I think that tuition should be lower, and I lose a vote at this board, I am not going to change my view that tuition should be lower. What support means may be the tricky part here, in that you sort of work with that and you move on to the next conversation. That would also sort of subsume the prospect that we make a decision today, and then 3 years later, someone comes in and says we should reverse that decision. Are we supporting what the board did back in December of 2015, or are we not supporting what the board did back in December of 2015? So I think that it's a very dangerous thing. I think in this language, moving through the language, it's the point that you get to the Regents who speak forthrightly at board meetings, period. I don't have any issue with that. I think it's important that we understand that the tone and substance of our words has impact. When a regent says something, it's different than when you're not a regent and saying that same thing, particularly for the university community. I'm a little bit concerned about framing the issue as loyalty versus First Amendment, because what one person considers to be loyal, another person might consider to be disloyal. We have one of our Big Ten peers had an issue where it may or may not have been known to some members of their board that something very bad was happening within the institution. And if the board got together as a whole and ultimately said, well, we're just going to try to keep this quiet because if this gets disclosed, it's a problem. Well, we now know the public has certainly weighed in that was the wrong strategy. I don't think that we should be in a position to compel silence, to squelch dissent. I think that open conversation is really what makes our form of government successful, and I think that it's actually healthier for the university to have the ability for people to have opinions and to maintain those opinions and share those opinions. Subject to Regent Svigum's wise counsel that when you speak on your own behalf, you clarify that you are speaking on your own behalf. Thank you.
Regent Davenport.
Thank you, Chair Maron. As a new regent, I would like to just express my appreciation for policy that's clear, coming on, that does set the tone and the expectations for regent behavior and expression. And I appreciate having a chair that speaks for the board, and do have the expectation myself that others that speak do clarify that it's their personal view, but I don't know what the media's obligation is to note that, and that's just a comment.
All right. Thank you. Regent McMillan?
Thank you, Chair Mayor, on, again, good discussion around an exceedingly difficult topic. And I think all of these policies that we're talking about are very code of ethics, whether it's the fourth, fifth, or the first item we started with today. They all go to trying to uphold the sanctity and effectiveness of the governance process. I mean, every one of them. And what's here now that hasn't been here before is it was in a different place in the policy, but you need to be vocal and frank and share your governance perspectives in the boardroom. And that's where the board governance work should always occur. And when it drifts outside of the boardroom into the media, that's not good. I'm not pointing fingers at anybody or anything else, but it's just, I think to the extent we keep it here and we demonstrate to the constituents that look to us to lead this institution that our conversations will occur here, we're frank and forthright about them, and when a decision's made that we don't support, we do what this policy says, and that is that you move forward. And I think Regent Roche has identified where the slippery slope is and the tricky piece of what support means, but using the media to effectuate or to attempt to effectuate a governance outcome that didn't happen in this room is what I think the conduct we're trying to get at and make sure it doesn't happen. And the second piece is we always want to prioritize the president as the primary speaker for this institution. And as I think some combination of what Regents Swigum and Rocha said, in a case where the board has acted, I think the board chair should and can be an effective voice for the board and hopefully in alignment, with the president when that's appropriate. The third piece is that this gets communications strategy and communications effectiveness gets hardest when there's a crisis. And, but I don't know how we ever write that into policy, but that's when crisp communication on behalf of the board and the university as a whole is most important and probably when it's most difficult to effectuate. But I'm not suggesting we write anything in about crisis communications, but to me that's when this, the work of the board and the work of the president's office become most important, and it's most critical that we communicate with the world as one voice. If we are of one voice, we're not, then we shouldn't communicate as one voice. But anyhow, I over my time, I've observed that if people speak up in this room, it gets to the bottom of most of the issues.
Thank you, Regent McMillan. Let me just jump in here and share my own view on this. I do think we need a policy about our role with respect to the media. I think I agree, as I listen to Regent McMillan, I think you've made some excellent points that I agree with in terms of what constitutes good governance. I think it starts with the work of the administration, the president's office, comes to us as a board, and that the governing decisions should take, and the discussion and the dialogue and the input that we each have to convince each other of the pros and cons of whatever issue is coming before us should take place here in board meetings and not outside of the context of a board meeting. I think that's where we learn from each other, where we come to compromise and the best decisions of all. I think that when we start speaking outside to the media and sharing our own personal views, I think that runs counter to what is the good governance concept here of going first to the administration for their view, coming to us on particular issues, and creates a quagmire of issues, and in particular in crisis situations. So I do think we need a policy about when we when we speak to the media. I will say my own practice thus far, and in part it's because I'm new, is that when the media has approached me on any issue is to defer to the president or to the chair, with the hope then that we will be addressing it if necessary here at the board, and not sharing my own personal views where I don't know if they are going to change in dialogue with each other or be accurately portrayed. So I personally am in favor of clarifying this issue so that we all know what to expect of ourselves and of each other. With that, Regent Shu has a comment, and then we've got two remaining topics that are also equally important, and I want to make sure we can get input on them. Regent Shu?
Thank you, Chair Mayron. My view is that what we have already is fairly clear in terms of how we should operate. I think in view of transparency, a lot of the things that we say in meetings is reported in the media. In some cases, what we say is actually, we're asked for clarification after the meeting. Well, what did you mean by that? Or do you have anything else to say? They don't report on everything we say in a meeting. But I would say that there are very few people also watching on YouTube and going back on YouTube and watching the meetings and trying to figure out what we say. So there's an efficiency here. If you have an issue, and one that's in the media right now is the one about tuition. And clearly, as Regent Rocha spoke about, we don't all agree on tuition. And now we have, yesterday we had a meeting where we discussed the NR&R tuition, and that tuition strategy was a success, was deemed to be a success. Well, now everybody's trying to, say that, okay, well, it's successful, so now what? And so there's always questions beyond. And I think anybody who asks me is, whether they're in the media or anywhere else in the state or outside the state of Minnesota, is going to get an answer from me. And that's part of the transparency that I think we need to provide. Now, as for the chair speaking for the board, I'm totally in agreement with that. But the chair has to speak truthfully. And if the chair makes a mistake, the chair has to correct his statement, his or her statement. And that hasn't always happened in the past. In fact, there are cases where the chair has said things in stuff that's never even been voted on that has been inaccurate. And I have actually written emails to say that we should you revise the statement. And of course, the statement doesn't get revised. So then I have an opportunity, I always have an opportunity to speak out if I think that the chair is misrepresenting the board, and I think that's my obligation to do so. So I don't think we need anything in addition to what's already in there. Thank you.
All right. Any further comments by any regents who have yet to have spoken? All right. Regent Rocha, you had a second comment, and then we'll move on to the next area.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. I just want to be real clear. I don't support. I don't think I'm in the same position as the chair. I don't believe that we should be in the business of seeking to suppress people's perspectives, despite the fact that we've gone through this process. I understand the balance with good governance and what that means. Again, one person's troublemaker is another person's visionary. And sometimes history treats that differently than the immediate moment and again, the zeitgeist of the people within that particular room at that time. And I perish the idea that our approach to this would be to somehow try to penalize people for thought and for expressing that thought. One of the ironies of these last 4 years, going on 5 back on the board, is that there have been people who have spoken to this point and raised concern about people having public commentary about things separate from the board chair, separate from the board conversation, and yet I can, and if you want, I'll send you links to circumstances where virtually every one of them have spoken about an issue on which they disagreed with the decision of the board, but afterward they said, I don't agree with this. I think this is too high for NR&R or whatever the case is. We also have members of this board who are tapped by the board itself to write editorials in newspapers around the state. Well, are they speaking for themselves? Are they speaking for the board? I didn't vote to have Regent, Schmidt, write this editorial. And so, we're very inconsistent with the application of this sort of concept that the only person that should ever be speaking outside of the confines of this board would be the chair. It is also a little bit incongruous that the that we talk about, the only conversation should occur in this room. We have media here right now. This is an open meeting. And I've actually had members of our board leadership call me on the carpet and say, well, you're speaking to the media about this. And I go back and point out, well, that was actually a quote taken from something I said at the board meeting. I haven't spoken to anybody since then. So they, if the media chooses to use comments from the dissidents, the people that may have lost out on a vote, that certainly isn't our doing. And so I think that I am very much about more speech is better. And I come back and say, well, as a matter of governance and as a matter of leading this board, it's hard work to get 12 people from various backgrounds and all over the state to all be in agreement about things. If I go 3, 4, or 5 months without having spoken with the chair of the board or the chair of a committee or otherwise, it wouldn't be unusual that maybe my certain perspective, it may sort of start to deviate. It's a lot of work to communicate with all the members of a board or all the members of a committee to make sure everybody has their input. And when I would talk, to anybody that served in the legislature, you certainly wouldn't have a rule that says, well, no member of the state house is allowed to speak outside of the vote that they, the speech and the vote that they took on the floor. But the leaders of the various caucuses need to make sure that their members have a basis to get behind a certain position, right? And so I would much rather we put the work in to ensure that in major public issues at this significant public university, that each of us is part of that conversation and we're brought to a point where we understand that public commentary can be damaging to the institution. But there may be points, as we've seen in institutions that have had crisis, where that person speaking out actually ends up bringing that institution to a better place than they would have been as if there had been some suppression of people's opinions. And so I don't support putting anything in place that would penalize people bringing their good intended and their loyal perspective on how the university is best served by their service. I would note that there have been many times where I have had very strong opinions that could have been shared publicly, but I worked very hard within the institution to try to bring change as opposed to simply creating some sort of a public brouhaha that would damage the institution. Where we each draw that line, I think, should be up to each of us, and we should respect each other for the office that we hold. Thank you.
Thank you, Regent Rocha. I think that this topic in particular, if we go back to the questions that Executive Director Steves raised, I'm not sure we have yet consensus on this issue as to whether there should be a policy. I think we all agree we have individual First Amendment rights to speak, but the question then is, are they tempered or circumscribed by our fiduciary responsibilities, which we will be hopefully defining with greater clarity in terms of duties of loyalty and care to this university. And to the extent where we have those First Amendment rights and rights to share our comments, the timing and where they get shared, is it solely in a board meeting? Is it before a board meeting, after a board meeting, when a decision has or hasn't been made? I think those are the really tough issues that we're trying to wrestle with. I appreciate the comments here today, and we'll see if we can put something together or for your consideration. And I do think as we flesh out any language, it always fleshes out the issues that are on people's minds. With that, let's move on to the next topic, which is been labeled here, breaches of the Code of Ethics. And again, I want to phrase this as whether there should be a policy that allows the board to self-police itself regarding its board members' conduct. And if there should be some sort of self-policing mechanism, whatever the rules of conduct are that we adopt to conduct ourselves, what those self-policing mechanisms could be. I don't want to get into right now, if we can avoid it, our authority to do that. I realize that's a discussion that we will have to have as to what authority do we have to self-police ourselves and the extent we do. I think for right now, I would like rather to focus the discussion on whether people are interested in having mechanisms to self-police themselves, and if so, what those mechanisms might be. And maybe the way to frame it is assuming that there was the most egregious egregious conduct you could possibly think of that a region could engage in should the board have the ability to take action with respect to that individual. So our choices are to remain silent on this. Right now, we do incorporate the Roberts Rules of Order. My own review, I did ask that they be attached. I don't know if you took the time to read them. My own view is we don't want to be relying on Roberts Rules of Order. It is so arcane and so difficult to read. If in fact we do want to have self-policing mechanisms and create a process for them, I would suggest we devise our own and not rely on that process. It's very difficult to make your way through it. If you disagree, be sure you communicate that. So with that, let's open it for discussion. Regent Beeson.
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Under the previous regime of this committee, Regent Rocha and I did discover that we are subject to the Roberts Rule of Orders. Hasn't actually been well known, and we probably need some additional training around that, or at least for those in leadership positions. But I also agree that we're not bound by those as it relates to every element. And so the question about whether we should be self-policing, I think, yeah, who else is going to police us if we don't police ourselves? The question is, what does that mean? And I would say on the issue of breaches, they should be, we can't be specific about what might constitute a breach, but it should be a substantial breach. It should be very broad language, and there ought to be a supermajority of the board that determines that a breach has occurred. It can't be a majority. I'm just talking really very much at a high level, that it's got to be 8 of the 12 or 9 of the 12 or something. We can't be operating on these matters with a 6-5 vote, 7-5 vote. Then as relates to remedies, I think they need to be more specific, and there should be probably several, but they should be more specific, so it takes the guessing game out about what the board can do and what it can't do. And again, imposing those would be by more of a supermajority. So those are just some of the really broad reactions I think you're asking for this conversation.
All right. Regent Rocha, you had a comment.
Yeah, thank you, Madam Chair. And Regent Beeson and I, did have lengthy conversations about getting at these issues. We clearly lack the talent to get it to this level of refinement for a good conversation as a board. But so a couple things.
Maybe third time's a charm.
Third time's a charm. That's right, Madam Chair. So a couple thoughts on this. I'm concerned that we spend a lot of energy on this. The challenge of governance and the types of conversations that I believe we as the board and the administration that we retain to run this critical institution, it's big stuff. And so I understand this, but I felt like we've had a lot of energy on this in the last several years, and I haven't, it's felt a bit like a solution looking for a problem, but that, of course, is a matter of opinion. The two things that I would say, if we are going to put some sort of language in, because we already do have a process, and I think the chair makes a good point that, even if we were to simply take the concept of that process but write it in a way that is understandable and functional, with the same sort of open-endedness of Robert's rules, there may be some advantage to that. We start to bump up against some constitutional considerations when we start penalizing members of the board, particularly if it relates to their ability to hold their office when the Constitution gives that authority to the legislature. But I would say functionally on this particular language, I think that you would need to have a supermajority to simply bring any kind of a complaint against another member. You can certainly, you could imagine a 7-5 vote on a contentious issue, yielding the 5 people in the minority to be angry enough to bring a complaint against someone in the majority. So when the threshold is only 5, I think that on its face, before the person has a chance to even reply to a specific charge against them, on its face, a supermajority of the board should believe that if true, these allegations would constitute a matter that would support some sort of action by the board as a whole. So 5 is, I understand the point of the 5 is getting at just a meeting to have a general discussion. This is actually going after one of our colleagues. This is a much higher threshold, I think, versus just simply saying we want to talk about whether or not we should be building a sports bubble. For example, the next part is I'm concerned about the language significant breach of fiduciary responsibilities. That is extremely subjective. I would point out that when we even talking about First Amendment versus fiduciary duties, I don't see those as mutually exclusive. I think that part of your First Amendment analysis is within your fiduciary obligation. And so I would actually suggest that a complaint alleging a breach of a violation of the code of conduct, and then if the fiduciary obligation is under that sort of, I think, gets at that. But I think to talk about fiduciary responsibilities, I think somebody's desire to send a certain amount of funding to a certain campus is an outrage. I think that's a terrible decision, and it violates our fiduciary duty to do what's best for the university. It gets way too subjective to label it at that, because we each approach that fiduciary role differently. That being said, I would say that we would step very carefully into the conversation about what types of remedies we would have with respect to members of the board. Particularly, again, I would hate to see this being used as a cudgel to suppress the perspectives of people who were elected by the legislature to bring their perspectives to this board. I would also suggest that there are already substantial things that this board can do. If a person is acting in a way that is inconsistent with our code of conduct, the board leadership can address that through committee chair positions or chair assignments. If the malfeasance is by the chair or vice chair of the board as a whole may vote to remove them from the chair or vice chair position. There are already certain things that can happen that way. I would suggest that if there were ever something, if I were aware of something that a colleague was doing that would rise to the level that I thought that this board needed to take action against them, I'm probably going to be talking to the Attorney General as opposed to the board itself. That it would have to be something that an external agency that has the legislative authority to address who is serving on this board. That seems to be the right place to lodge these kinds of questions. But if we are going to codify what is already in place by our adoption of Robert's rules and the provisions within that, I would say it needs to be a supermajority to bring it forward so we don't have strategic investigation to damage those of different mind, which can be done. And then also I would go to a code of conduct violation as opposed to a breach of fiduciary simply because of the subjectivity of that analysis. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Regent Anderson?
Thank you, Chair. Chair Marin. I kind of have a unwritten rule to myself I don't really need to speak unless I can add to the conversation, and I might be going against that rule right now because Regent Rocher probably touched on the 2 points that I wanted to touch on here, but I'm going to say I'm just quicker. I agree, significant breach is very, very subjective. I think that's where we go with that. And my other point is I was thinking of constitutional powers when this was brought up. In my opinion, the legislature has the power to appoint these 12 people. So I wonder, where am I to be one of the people that would usurp that power, unappoint or ask one of these people to leave or something like that? I don't think I have that power. So those are kind of my 2 points, the subjectivity of significant breach and why should I have the power to do what the legislature constitutionally has.
Any opinion apart from removal as to other remedies that are sanctions as part of, for example, should we have a self-policing mechanism, and are there other mechanisms that you believe the board could impose on sanction? Yes.
Potentially.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you for that clarification. Any other comments on this particular topic by any other regents? All right, we will then move to the last item, which is information requests. And that is whether there should be a policy that sets out clear expectations for how Regents request university information and how the administration handles those requests. Any comments or input by Regents on this particular topic? Regent Rocha.
Madam Chair, I'll finally speak up on a topic. I think this is an important question. Again, I am, and you, I think, very aptly pointed out that we already have, or I think Mr. Steves in your comments talked about the data practices request. I perish at the thought that we would have to resort to data practices requests to seek information from our president's office, and I can't imagine that that's the way she would want to have that kind of interaction. I do think it's absolutely fair to have a process through our board office for specific requests. I do think that it's, again, in my laissez-faire approach to regenting, I think that it's to contact, to be going out to specific units and specific individuals, I think is, can be a bit troublesome for an institution. But I think that going through the board office, having a process, which I think has worked well, certainly during my tenure, back to the board, with then the conversation where if there are a substantial number of requests or a request that requires a substantial amount of work, that the board office, working through the board leadership, are having a conversation with that member of the board. So that, Regent Mayron, we know you asked for this information. Please understand that it's going to take this amount of work, and this is why. And then you can determine, whether you want to make an alteration. And if it at that point becomes unreasonable, perhaps we as a board can have a conversation and say, well, this request for, the information about everybody who's ever been a part of the university in any way, we might, as a board, decline that request. So to me, that feels like a better way to handle this as opposed to trying to put some sort of indicator in there that I think can sometimes lead to haves and have-nots in terms of access to information, where one person can be squelched and another person can have unfettered access. So I like what we've been doing. I think it's about communication with members and understanding the resources that it takes, and I trust my colleagues to be reasonable in that respect.
Okay, thank you very much. Regent Beeson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I agree with those comments from Regent Rocha that we need to memorialize the process about requests go through the board office. I think the board chair can referee if there's sort of if there's pushback from the administration in terms of the timing or the scope of the request, and maybe letting the board be the final arbiter of it. Hopefully, we'd never come to that level, but I think we do need an expectation here, and we need a policy. It's absolutely critical people go through the board office, and there's just the risk of intimidation and bullying by information is power, and having board people directly ask for information is not right at any level at all. So whatever we can do to smooth this out, people do have the right to information, and that's, again, it's sort of a First Amendment, not a First Amendment, but it's a right to information is a given here.
Thank you. Being aware of the time here, we are at 11:15. Our meeting is supposed to end at 11, and I want to make sure that President Gable has adequate time to address the third topic on our agenda. What I'd be interested in hearing from those regents, and I've got Regent Sviggum and Regent Simonson who would like to provide their input, is I'm hearing from Regent Hsu and Regent Beeson that having a policy that manages requests for information and running it through the board office would be a good thing to provide guidance to all of us, and a mechanism if there's too much information or it's asked too quickly on how to resolve that. So perhaps Regent Sviggum, Regent Simonson, and I now see Regent Hsu has added his name to the list. If you disagree with that or have a different thought, that's what I'd be interested in making sure we hear, so that we have all views expressed, so that we can move this along.
And Madam Chair, thank you. I think I'm going to give you a little flexibility because looking forward to the full board meeting, I think we're going to finish in a very quick period of time. I don't think it's going to be a 2-hour board meeting.
Okay.
I'm going to suggest unilaterally, with Brian giving me a stern look, that if we don't
Yeah,
start
he's sending you a wackadoo. Did he just send you a
10 minutes
wackadoo?
later in the full board meeting, we'll make it up there.
All right.
Madam Chair, this may be a chance to try sanctions out on,
Coming from a different life, and then I've had no problem at all going through my requests to administration, to staff, to Brian Burnett, or anybody going through the board office. I've had no problem whatsoever. But I'm concerned about gatekeepers. I'm concerned about, and I want to balance that with the overburden that might be requests of information from 12 of us. But I go from a different life, and I can imagine telling 133 other members of the House of Representatives that they can only request information of a department or a House research or whatever it may be if they went through the Speaker's office. I think I wouldn't last the Speaker very long if that were true. So I've had no problems whatsoever. The board office has been great. The administration has been great in my requests. But I want to make sure that gatekeeper allows me to get the information I need and I request. What I would suggest, Madam Chair, is so that when I request, not when I talk to Vice President Burnett after a meeting, I just need a clarification of a number. That's great. He can give it to me. But if I'm requesting a full, comprehensive study of what our options are to balance this $50 million hole we might have next year, you know what? I want that information shared with all board members. So when I request something, I'm going to suggest that when we request it in a comprehensive way, a formal way, that, Mr. Beeson is correct. Information is power. It is. I think when I request something, I have no problem with being shared with all board members, whether it be through any of the administration or information I've received from various departments. So I'm just going to suggest we make sure it's shared with all board members.
All right, thank you very much. Regent Simonson?
Thank you, Chair Myron. But I agree with what Regent Figgin was just saying, and as far as information, it's not only power, but it's also necessary as we look at as regents. So it's not just power. And so what I've tried to do, and just for clarification, is I have asked for a number of information through the board, through Brian, but I've also gone direct, but I always copy him and let him know. I just did it a week ago. I asked somebody administration a question, but I always copied Brian. So I would like that flexibility, because there are a lot of questions that can come up, and I don't know if I just want to put them on Brian follow up. So I'd like to have that flexibility with a copy.
Thank you. Thank you. Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chair Miron. I struggle here with whether or not we need a different policy. It depends on the policy. I guess the way I'm going to come down on this. I have not had to file a DPA to get information, but in the early days of my service on this board, I was taken aback by how little information we received on certain topics and how we were asked to make decisions at the last minute. Even this past week, even yesterday, we were asked to make decisions on something where there's information that should be available to us, and we should have it on a timely basis, and we should have time to review that information. So I think it's a struggle. In the past, I would ask for information that I thought the administration should have readily available, because they were making decisions and making recommendations to us. So I think now the Texas example is a little bit of an outlier, but I don't know the circumstances as to why. I actually know the regent who made that request. I don't know the circumstances as to why he made that request, but he was clearly, and this actually resulted in lawsuits in the state of Texas over some of these and other things. But it was about corruption. And this regent was trying to solve the problem. And they have had a lot of problems out there. And now this region is actually getting awards for actually trying to solve the problem long before other people realized there was a problem. And the reason he was able to find the problem was because he was given some information and then not additional information, because I think they started becoming concerned that he was going to unravel the plot. So I would say, that information is important. It's power. The regents, a lot of people, the biggest thing I think that people are surprised about when they talk to you about your service as a regent is how little information we actually get on certain topics. People think we already know about everything, and when they ask us a question, they expect us to understand what's going on. And I understand we can't know about everything, but at least on the big topics, I think we should have more information. It should be more timely. There's definitely information asymmetry on this board, where some people have information a long time before other people do. And the run-of-the-mill board members, myself included, on most occasions, get the information, less than a week before. And then there's always supplemental information that we receive the night before a board meeting or night before a committee meeting. So I would say that it depends on the process or policy, and I do think that we should do a better job of getting everybody on the same page with respect to information. Thank you.
Thank you. President Gable, I understand you would like to be recognized on this issue, so you are recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, members of the board. I want to state expressly the commitment by the administration to be transparent and forthcoming with information, with full appreciation that this is somewhat of a moving target depending on the issue or question of the day, the decision being made, the question of exploration. The value for the administration in exploring this evolution in the policy is just in the consistency in how the requests are made, so that there is a known standard for how information would be provided. And so there is some value in that side of things in order to address exactly what Regent Hsu and others are describing, which is how the information flows. If it's a known process or an established process, then there can be some certainty around what the expectations would be. Thank you.
All right. Regent Kenyatta?
Thank you, Madam Chair. Just a couple thoughts. I think the policy or the discussion we're having is to prevent abuse, to prevent great abuse of the information request. And I think what I've heard from my colleagues, and definitely my experience, is that at least now information is readily or quickly available. Everyone said that they've had a great experience with the board staff and the administration, and I would agree. So I think what we're looking to do is really just make sure that those extreme, unreasonable cases that some people have given as examples are regulated and whatnot. I would also echo and agree that and this has happened in the past, when one member will request information and it's shared across, that's very helpful. That's very helpful because it's maybe some things I hadn't thought of or things like that, but then you get that forwarded email, and I would like to see that continue. And then I would just like to make a comment. It might have been Regent Swigum who talked about there are times when it's appropriate to approach the administrator and ask a simple question. You gave the example of the senior vice president. And I think that's appropriate and that makes sense. I just like us to delineate between senior administrators and walking into, the Carlson School and asking the clerical staff questions. I think there's just a bit of a different relationship there, and that may be appropriate in one situation and not in the other.
Thank you, Regent Kenyatta. Regent Beeson, we'll close with your question.
Thank you.
Comments.
I was going to mention, and Regent Kenyatta prompted me, and Regent Simon's comment. The practice that I was always taught with was if we're going to go to staff, we need to keep it at the senior level, that they really get unnerved if we're going down talking to a professor directly or a staff person. So it needs to be at the dean level or a vice provost or something like that. Otherwise, it just reverberates through the whole system, and they're out of the loop, and, you know, we're micromanaging, and so if we're going to go direct, and there are times when if it's a very, simple question, simple answer, or general conversation, then keep it at a high level in the organization.
Thank you, Regent Beeson. All right, I think that covers the second item on our agenda. Before we go to the third item, we are going to take a 2-minute break here, and then we will resume with President Gable's presentation.
I just want to, when we were at Wiseman for that dinner, Ethan talking to the kid working at the desk. No. Not yet.
What if they can hear us?
I am ending the recess of the short recess that we were taking of the Governance and Policy Committee. Hopefully my colleagues are all returning here. And at this time, we are going to move to the third topic, which is for President Gable to share with us her plan for advancing revisions to the naming policy. So I'm going to turn this over at this time to President Gable.
Thank you, Chair Maron, Vice Chair Hsu, and members of the board. Just as a reminder of a history I think we all know, last April, the board passed a resolution directing the president to first develop during the 2020-2021 academic year, in consultation with the Board of Regents, ongoing commemorations, educational activities, and/or permanent educational displays within or nearby one or more of these buildings to reflect the university's complex institutional history. 2, consider and recommend to the Board of Regents additional commemorations, educational activities, or markers across the system to promote reflection on the university's history. And 3, recommend revisions to the Board of Regents policy, namings that establish clear principles and procedures to guide future renaming discussions. So today marks a new beginning in our work towards a greater understanding of our complex institutional history. And it's important that the next step in this work are done in a collaborative and consultative manner. So we reopen the door to this discussion with a brief update of what's happened up to this point, and then a discussion of where things are with renamings policy specifically, apropos to being within the governance committee. So as you might imagine, I've had multiple conversations with a variety of people about this topic, both before my official start and certainly since. I formally met with members of the task force on building names and institutional history to seek their advice and counsel about my suggested path forward to answering the board's charge. And this group collectively marks the beginning of multiple additional conversations we will have across a variety of stakeholders whose feedback, expertise, and engagement is appreciated and welcomed. We discussed the importance of internal and external consultation, contextualization, and the need to anchor this important work as an institutional commitment. And I look forward to the ongoing input as this process develops, as well as consulting widely in the days ahead with our shared governance community, including faculty, students, and staff, community members, and also engaging our partners, supporters, and alumni around the state and beyond. So at this time, I'd like to share with you an outline of my plan to answer the board's charge, beginning with the development and adoption of a renamings policy framework. At the December meeting and after broad consultation, I will present peer examples, policy direction, and suggested next steps for your consideration, much as Executive Director Steves described with the board policy, so that you have something in hand that you can react to. And we're working on gathering those suggested policies and working them through the consultative process on campus and in the community now. At the February meeting, the committee will review that proposed language and amendments to the policy with the goal for board action in June. Second, we're forming a president's collaborative to focus on our institutional history and to advise me in the other aspects of the next phases of this work. I'll be providing more detailed information about this collaborative as it evolves. We're just getting started now. But we expect the collaborative to make recommendations around the educational activities, and we're starting this right away, largely in line with the recommendations that the task force made beyond renaming itself. We're establishing a high-profile series of events and speakers that will engage in university history through an exploration of contemporary social issues. You'll be hearing more about this event series soon, the first of which is anticipated to be scheduled later this fall. But in this spirit, and this is not a university event, but I would like to make members of the Board of Regents aware and invite them to join me on October 15th at the Minnesota Historical Center in St. Paul to hear Christopher Lehman talk about his new book, Slavery's Reach, Southern Slaveholders in the North State. We're also working with faculty to grow capacity around courses and research to help tell university history across building and spaces. And we're working with the Executive Vice President and Provost and Dean of Libraries to recommend a plan to better resource university archives and libraries. We're working all together to determine whether or how university history and university archive work at this higher level may call for additional positions in public history or a full-time archivist to serve as a point person for ongoing work in this matter. So I look forward to briefing you further about these important initiatives in the coming months, and I look forward to our discussion today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, President Gable. Any questions or comments by any of the regents with respect to the plan that President Gable has laid out? Regent Hsu.
Thank you, Chairman Ron. Thank you, President Gable. I appreciate that you're already working on this this area, and that I know we gave an extended deadline through December 2020 originally. My concern here, I've articulated this before, but my concern here is that we have not, through the failure of the first process or the last process, we do not have a proper accounting of what actually happened back 100 years ago, or nearly 100 years ago, 70 years ago. And you're already scheduling speakers who are undoubtedly going to use the document that has severe flaws and problems associated with it. And I want to just make sure that you're aware, and we talked earlier in the audit meeting about ethics and brand and all that kind of stuff. And I think that we're doing a disservice to our institution by having false narratives of the past out there. And then we're going to invite speakers in to probably use that false narrative. And I think we're jumping the gun a little bit because I think we need a proper accounting of what actually happened with full information instead of just selected information, cherry-picked information. So I just caution you that this is going to be the beginning of another process that is going to probably bring out some of the concerns of the earlier report.
President Gable, would you like to respond?
Yes, thank you, Madam Chairman. Regent Hsu, the speaker series that we have in mind, and the only reason I'm not describing it expressly is because the dates and time aren't confirmed, is a noted historian who would rely on many documents and an extensive amount of research and before making the presentation, so I don't think there's any concern with launching an event series that brings in subject matter experts. I think, in fact, that's how we look at institutional history across a broad spectrum and move forward so that we can further explore the issues of the day. If the board in its collective wisdom thinks that there is action to be taken about the task force report, I think that's separate from the charge that is was presented to the president in April. The events that I describe are related specifically to that charge, which would be around educational activities that further our understanding. Thank you.
Thank you. Regent Spiegelman?
Madam Chair, very quickly, President Gable, thank you for your quick attention to this and then moving forward as one region, not as the board, but as one region. Let me I suggest to you anyway that we not become too overburdensome with the higher education process of committee after committee and study and everything. I would tell you that we had a very extensive discussion. It was passionate. It was emotional in the last year. You viewed all the discussions in the meetings. I hope that we can move forward rather quickly rather than just, I know the higher education way is to have committees so nobody becomes accountable and responsible. It's a committee process, but that's the higher education way. I come from a different life. President Gable, if we were just to say today, let's adopt the renaming principles and guidelines, and I realize we got to have them that Stanford has. I'm not opposed to being the Stanford of the Midwest, not at all. And I read them 6 months ago, and I completely forgot but I was impressed at that time. I think this can be done quicker, more efficiently, and probably cheaper than some of the collaboratives, the full-time, what are we going to hire? A full-time arborist or? Archivist. Archivist, oh good, that's just what we need, another guy. The series of events and speakers, I know you got to go through the process, but let's get her done at the end.
Thank you, Regent Sviggum. Regent Beeson?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I applaud the president for continuing the conversation. We do need, the goal for us is to set out is to relook at the policy. And the policy, as we talked about, needs principles. And the principles, we didn't really focus on that as we jumped into the three specific building that were the subject of our faculty's research. But, I think, there's going to be buildings that we're clearly going to want to rename. I think, but we have to start with those principles and let's stay on the high ground. We are a policy board. Now, the conversation is going to continue and should continue on campus about this subject. And I just hope there's a balance of opinion between those who feel strongly about the fact that Kaufman and Nicholson and Middlebrook's name should be removed, and those who don't, including family members, including, and that there's a recognition that the research, the faculty was pushed toward a deadline that was really unfortunate to them. And I do want to tell them that I think they were put in a position of great difficulty to try to attempt to do a biography about any of these people with what the resources they had available was unfair. There's these people had complex legacies. We all know that. But I'm okay with the conversation as long as it can be balanced, and maybe the board members or the chair gets engaged in this so that we're a major part of the story up to this point, and that that conversation. I think to not talk about it is just would be a problem.
All right. Thank you, Regent Kenyana. And then we'll close with Regent Rocha.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Madam President. Just want to point out, and it's been said before, that the charge we're discussing is separate from the discussions of the past and the vote of the past. Obviously, they're not separate in practice, but in terms of governance, they are, and we should be sure to look at them that way. Regent Sviggum, I think everyone would love to see this process continue, and President Gable's done that by bringing it quickly, but we don't want to, expediency is the word that comes to mind, quick but maybe not done right. What I want to reiterate, President Gable, and this, not to say that you're not doing this, I actually heard it, but I really do want to reiterate that this process has to be owned by the university community, driven by you, and the charge is for you, but the history that brought us here was driven by the faculty, by the students, and at every step of the way, whether it's the event series, the full-time archivist, the policy, the university community still has to be a part of that. And I think, going that non-university way would kind of leave out some of those stakeholders that brought us here and should definitely be a part of the train as it continues. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Regent Kenyana. And closing then with Regent Rocha. Any further comment?
Thank you, Chair Mayor, and thank you to President Gable for taking this important and difficult issue on so early in your tenure. Just a couple of quick thoughts. I'm very happy that we are getting right at the principles in the policy. And echoing a bit what my colleague Regent Beeson stated a minute ago, my sense was, along with the timeline, the lack of a coherent process. I mean, this is a board decision, which is why it ended up at the board. But in empowering the task force to present to the board, which for me was sort of amorphous until all of a sudden we're having this conversation, I don't think that we served them well by not having clarity in the process, by having a process that brought forward 4 individuals at the same, for buildings with individuals associated at the same time, something that I can't find any other institution in the nation thinking is a good idea, because they haven't done that. Nor did I think it was fair to have a lack of a standard that we were expecting for determining what the factual basis was, and then to allow for a consideration of when the facts would warrant a deviation from a lack of support for a prior board decision, so to speak. But anyway, so I would also point out that as you develop this, as I understand the charge said, in consultation with the Board of Regents, not a subset of the board, and the development, I think, I haven't been part of a process, I don't think, really, in talking about where we're going and why. And so that part of it, I'm a little bit concerned about, just to make sure that the process that we're putting forward in what we're going to do is in consultation with the board, as opposed, we may end up with a fully baked proposal that this is what's going to happen, and I don't, that's not as consultative as I was anticipating in this process. So I just want to raise the fact that as you go forward, I would hope that we would have that opportunity to have a dialogue about these kinds of things. The last comment that I'll make, I wish I was better with words. It goes a bit to Regent Svigum's general point, which is I want to strike the balance. I would hope the university is able to strike the balance between reckoning with history and difficult periods in history, particularly the way people were treated by this institution, and especially sort of recognizing this institution as a part of society, but not responsible for all of society, and that we really identify what the role of the university has been. Some of it very good, some of it not as good, and downright bad. But I think that that's important. But it also strikes me that we may be I want to avoid creating a giant apparatus that creates a basis to be offended. I grew up in a town with streets with names. I have no idea who any of the people were that were the namesakes of those names. Some of them may have been wonderful people, some of them may have been terrible people, but they were simply identifiers for me at that point in history. And so striking the balance between sort of creating the offense first and then spending a tremendous amount of energy addressing that. The problem is when you make that statement, some people would suggest that you're trying to mask history, or you're not wanting to take it into account, or to confront it or be accountable for it, whoever presently can be accountable for things that have happened in the past. So I just hope we're very sensitive about that we're not, that in the process we are appropriately trying to address the historical context, but not in a way that is simply trying to develop the offense so that we then have to create a solution to the offense, if that makes any sense. So my struggles with articulation right now are, I think, emblematic of the challenge that you face. And so I wish you well over the course of this, and I hope that we're able to be collaborative in that process.
President Gable, I do want to give you an opportunity to respond. I just do want to point out at the December meeting of this committee, we will, if you look at the work plan, that will address the policy framework for renaming buildings. It's the first of a three-part series geared towards development and adoption of a renaming policy framework, where we'll have the opportunity to evaluate peer examples and provide our own thoughts on policy and direction and next steps towards amending the board policy, meaning we are going to have an opportunity as a board to provide our input and guidance to President Gable as she proceeds forward with her work. And with that, President Gable, if you want to close with any additional remarks.
No, thank you, Madam Chairman.
All right, then that concludes the work of the Governance Committee. This meeting is adjourned.